was a time in this country, a long time ago, when reading wasn't just for fags, and neither was writing. People wrote books and movies that had stories, so you cared whose ass it was and why it was farting, and I believe that time can come again.
Hello and welcome to the Think Liberty podcast. This is episode 54, and I'm your host. I don't have a clever name to come up with this time, but I'm your host, Vinny Marshall, and today I am joined by two people that you'll probably be familiar with at this point, one of which is Lonnie Dupree. Lonnie, how are you doing?
I was going to try to introduce myself as like Gingham Paisley or something like that, but you already said my name, so
you can't.
Well, I'm all right.
Yeah, my fault. I'm sorry about that. And our second guest, do you want me to mention your name first, or do you just want to come out with one? You want to come up with your own name, or should I make it even?
Just
All right. Well, so our second guest is Amos Joseph from the Shitlord Preacher podcast. Amos has been on here before. You guys should be familiar with him by now. Well, that was fun, huh? How are you guys doing this evening?
doing pretty good.
Yeah, I'm all right.
All right, Lonnie. It doesn't. How come just all right? What's going? Yeah.
Oh no, I'm just saying, it's all right.
All right.
Not like there's anything wrong or anything. Just
Like,
I don't know.
you guys ever see that meme of the? It's like the kitty toilet thing, but it's got like a seatbelt on it.
What?
So there's this picture. No. So there's this picture of a kid that's like, it was like some toilet contraption for kids, like those training toilets, but it was like, it's got a seatbelt on it, and it was like, what kind?
Strap in.
Yeah, exactly. What kind of dump are you taking that you need a seatbelt for?
Right.
That's how I kind of feel right now. Like I'm strapped in for this conversation.
That's right.
You're fucking weird.
Yeah. So on this episode 54, there's been a lot of talk lately in the circles that we spend time in, talking about the differences in race and IQ, and this is a highly contested topic. I feel like whenever it gets brought up, people really bare their claws, for lack of a better term. And we were having a bit of a discussion about it, and we figured, hey, let's do an episode about it, and let's talk about it a little bit and the different kind of aspects for it. So we're all going to bring up our opinions on it and on the matter, and we're going to dive into it as best we can for some people that are probably less educated on this topic than a lot of other people are. And we're going to weigh in with our opinions. Just a bunch of assholes talking shit. What do you guys think about that?
Well, first, I just want to talk about them Jews.
Oh boy!
And no, no, just joking. You can edit that part out if you want.
No, I'm leaving it in here. You get to own that one.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna dive right into it. The book, I think we're all familiar enough with this book, right? There's a book that's usually at the center of this discussion, and that book is called The Bell Curve, and it was released in about 1994 by a couple of authors, right? It was
Charles Murray and Richard
Herrnstein,
something like that. Yeah,
Richard J. Herrnstein,
Not Spencer,
right? Not Richard Spencer, and it goes into a lot. I feel like I'm always the one talking. Amos, did you want to give a little bit of what this book goes into, or should I take care of it?
Okay, so disclaimer. Just so before we get into it, just so everyone knows, I am the one that is going to make my points against these other two.
You are fake
I actually
news.
don't know much. Exactly. I don't actually know much about the book itself. I've heard about it. I've heard that's kind of sort of the first time, I guess, it was brought into the mainstream. It's just with that book.
Mm-hmm.
And just to let everyone know that I am actually, I don't espouse any of the more alt-right leanings on the topic. I'm I've read some of the studies. I've seen some of the, I've talked to a lot of both skeptics and people who are for these ideas, and I tend to think I'm more, I guess, on the fence and on it. Like it could be a thing, but we really don't know that much because the studies can show some things are going on, but they also show some other things aren't going on. So there's more than we might think there is, but not as much as maybe some people would like it to be.
Okay. I think that's fair. Lonnie, how about you and your history in this topic? I guess it's best, right? So let's just get started laying out our positions here and where we're going to be coming from when we talk about this topic. So Lonnie, why don't you go ahead?
It's probably one. I don't want to say the dumbest thing I've ever heard of, but pretty. I don't know. I'd hate to reduce it down to something like that, but it is something that it never made any sense to me, like how people could look at any of this data and draw the conclusions that they are from it. So I'm definitely more of the, okay, so you tested some people and you got some results, but who did you test? What exactly are you trying to prove with this? What is the point of all of this? And why are you even bothering? And how are you not considering a whole bunch of other factors into why certain results may be present? So I'm kind of on the race realism doesn't exist, or however you want to word that, but yeah.
Sure. I think, and I am of the mind that the data exists, right? I'll unpack my arguments. I'm not a fan of the information espoused by the bell curve. So Amos is kind of on his own on this one. Do our best not to gang up on you and just have a discussion here. Because I think it's important. It's important to dig into it and to talk about the things that we think are wrong with it. And we've got someone that thinks that there might be some legitimate studies going on in the analysis. So just to give everyone a breakdown, this is just basic, right? I just pulled this from Wikipedia here. This is just kind of like a breakdown of what the book's about, just for anyone that might be curious. Now, again, this spans, this is more than the book, right? This topic as a whole, but again, this book always ends up as kind of the foundation of where these conversations stem from, as it's probably the most. Yeah, I don't know if there's been much work put together that was as expansive as this book on the topic. Maybe there's been a lot of work that was put together after as a response to this book, but before it, I don't think there was a lot that came out, right? So The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life is a 1994 book by psychologist Richard J. Herrnstein and political scientist Charles Murray, in which the authors argue that human intelligence is substantially influenced by both inherited and environmental factors, and it's a better predictor of many personal dynamics, including financial income, job performance, birth out of wedlock, and involvement in crime, than are an individual's parental socioeconomic status. They also argue that those with high intelligence, the cognitive elite, quote unquote, are becoming separated from those of average and below average intelligence. The book was controversial, especially where the authors wrote about racial differences in intelligence and discussed the implications of those differences. So there's your basic summary. So let's start the conversation with Lonnie said something that I thought was really interesting, and I'd like to get your input on this as well, Amos. So what do you do with it, right? So you have this data. Let's put aside our opinions on the data and or some of the conclusions that came to from the data, And I tend to agree with Lonnie in that. Right, so you have all this data. Why? What's the point? Right? What's to be proven with this data?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
So another thing to let the listeners know about this data and why I've chosen to talk about this. Actually, I didn't really care at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Not only a few months ago, I didn't care really much at all. But then when I was faced with, I had a discussion with a few people regarding it, individuals who also didn't really talk too much about it, but have read up on it. And, then I kind of heard, I heard about the likes of like Stefan Molyneux, but then I even heard people like Steven Pinker even kind of briefly talk about it. Just a lot of these different intellectuals have brought it up, and I thought it was kind of a weird thing. But I read up on some of the studies, and I've both spoken to people who are skeptical, who would probably be more like where I am. Just I kind of see it as like there probably is something. And the fact that some studies control for some of the more environmental factors shows that there could be something. But because this thing, IQ, intelligence, is such a tricky thing, just to begin with, there's too many factors that could play into, I think, on the molecular level, even just in how our brain works, that determines our IQ. Because you can have, in some cases, where environmental factors cause a huge shift in IQ, whereas you have in some cases where the genetic factor plays a larger role. It just depends upon what you're looking for, and what sort of factors you're trying to adjust for. And so, if I had gave like an overview, sort of like an overall view that I have, in the nature versus nurture when it comes to race and IQ, I would say it's half and half environment, half genetics. So, yeah.
So again, though, why? Right. The question still stands. So what is to be gained from this analysis? Right. So if you were to ascribe
if I
policy
were to want to try to use it
based on it, right.
Personally, I don't see any reason to really. I don't see any personal reason to gain anything from it. I've just looked into it enough that I personally see it as it's kind of interesting, if anything, that there could be more than most people might have an opinion on. It tends to be it's more leaning towards environmental than genetic when it comes to the race and IQ question. But then you can also adjust for just people groups in general, besides the typical, the general definition of race. Certain people groups you can adjust and find certain IQ discrepancy.
Right. And so I think it's important to point out. So this test, the sample size. I don't know how big the sample size was for the testing that went on for the data that was gathered in the analysis. That's the backbone of this book. But it's as best I can gather here. It was primarily gathered from an ASVAB test. So it's the military aptitude test, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and so, one of the things that stands out to me primarily with that is that isn't the ASVAB test more of a test about achievement rather than ability?
So, I've actually pulled up a couple of studies here, not based upon the book itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this. Some of my connections sent me basically a couple of articles to go over if you want to. Just showing a couple of studies first off, sort of setting the premise, like
Sure. Go ahead.
basically like are IQ tests racially biased? Are they non-biased? And so there was a study done on that 73% of experts that administer IQ tests conclude that it's not biased. Now, there was a study on that called Reeve and Charles from 2008, and then it goes into then there's a few other studies that control for IQ, so individuals of the same IQ across different races, what kind of things they've seen. So I think they adjusted here. The average IQ for a 29-year-old controlling for IQ. They did some studies on that to see like the difference between whites, blacks, and Latinos. An average 29-year-old of an average IQ has a 27%. 27% of the whites have a bachelor's degree. 11% of blacks have bachelor's degree, and then 10% for Latinos. But then when they looked at, there's another one here. It said,
hold on. Going back to that study that you just mentioned. So what were the IQ percentages among those? Well, no,
groups? they took the person with the average IQ at that age.
Oh, so these are all people with the same IQ.
They took the average IQ,
different degrees held by different percentages of the group.
Yeah, basically. So if you took the three main races, the whites, black, and Latinos, at least for America, and you just controlled for IQ, basically kept them at the same IQ. Let's say it's 100. That tends to be the average in most cases. Whites had a 27%. 27% of the whites they looked into had a bachelor's degree, whereas 11% of blacks and 10% of Latinos had that.
Okay.
So there's that. But they said there was another interesting thing that was where it said, let's see here. There was another thing, but then I know we talked a little bit about some of this goes into like your economic background too, socioeconomic background.
Mm-hmm.
So they controlled for that, and they looked at family income versus SAT scores.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, so for the family income, I think this was 2008. So as of 2008, this study showed, this is from the College Board, families who earned under $20,000 a year, the mean black score was 798, whereas the mean white score was 978. A gap of about 108. But as you approach, you go from under $20,000 a year upwards towards more than $200,000 a year. There's still a gap, but it goes from 180, which was the first one we stated, all the way to 100. The smallest gap that it showed was 143 points. So the mean white score was still higher, even in cases where the both the white and black families were earning over $200,000 a year. So some of the these studies are basically trying to control for certain environmental factors that people look into, like socioeconomic status. There was another one here. There was one known as the the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study. So they basically studied the children who were of different races than their adopted parents and measured their IQ at different points in their life. And it revealed that there were more ranges, where if like a black kid was with a white family versus a white kid with a white family, and then they had to cross that with like, okay, so then black kid with black family, white kid with white family, different things like, or white kid with black family, and found that there were certain ranges that these IQs tended to range in, factoring that in too. There was another one. I mean, of course, they touch on like incarceration and such, but there was something here. Another one I was trying to find. I'm referencing a site here that touched on a few different factors, but as I've looked through these, in the past few months, once people kind of, had these discussions with me about it, I've come to see that there might be something. Now, I haven't made that, leap over to, and I don't think I'm careful to not really make any leap into the whole, white man smart, black man stupid, which tends to be the crazy alt-right view on it. But I just look at it as, well, there might be something where genetics and your environment can both play a role, more than most people might think. But exactly how it plays into populations, we still don't know enough about it. And I think the fact that because of the controversy over it, people tend to fear going into it under, fear of being like a racist or something.
Sure. So my first question, hearing about those studies, is, did you come across any data that seemed as if it were set out specifically to falsify the hypothesis? Or was it just data that essentially just confirmed the hypothesis? Because that's one of my issues with when you talk about this book, is because I don't know if you've heard of you get the falsification models and falsification proofs, right? And it's kind of a way of looking at scientific method. Is sometimes you're going to see people approach an analysis where it's clearly coming from a standpoint of where they have data, they put it together, and the goal of the data was to prove a hypothesis. And then there's
yeah, for sure.
And it seems to me to be, with all these studies that are done between race and IQ, that it's almost always done in a way that where it's like, this is the hypothesis and here's the data to support the hypothesis. It's never Okay. I rarely read articles about data that falsifies the hypothesis.
Real quick here, Vinny, before we go further, I just want to clarify something. I actually misread this. I'm sorry. Because, excuse me, the article is showing some of these are they're basically copies off of these studies themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I should clarify. Before controlling for IQ was for the bachelor's degree,
mm-hmm.
whites 27%, blacks 11%, Latinos 10%. However, when controlling for IQ, I should have been more clear in this because I got confused reading it because the print is so light. I was just scanning through it too quickly. Average age, average IQ for college graduates, which they say the average IQ is 114 for a college graduate.
Okay.
So when holding that constant, blacks have a slightly higher likelihood of getting a college degree, with whites second, Latinos third, but whites and Latinos being 1% apart.
Okay, so there's not a huge difference there. It's basically saying that once people get...
Once you control for IQ, it's one thing. But then when you don't control for IQ, look at the whole population as a whole. Yeah, whole population.
In aggregate.
Then you start seeing the aggregate. Yeah, the aggregates give you one thing, but then when you control for IQ, it's a little different. So...
Okay, and so this is good. Moving right along in this discussion. So, Lonnie, I know that you have some opinions on this, and you've articulated them well in other times. So perhaps, if you'd like to do that now, what are your opinions on why you think that aggregate data exists, and it's different, right? Why do you believe that the data inside this book that we're talking about, or the studies that may people may go over, do show that there are differences?
I would say, really, I would put it down to social, economic, and environmental factors more than anything genetic. I mean, if you consider, in America, during segregation, black schools, for one, weren't very. There were nothing to write home about. Then post-integration, you still see black students not getting some of the same opportunities while in school, things like that. Plus, whenever you consider a lot of like the government providing welfare and incentives to break up the black family, and you have a lot of kids growing up in single parent households and stuff like that. It gives a lot of different factors that come into play that would affect someone's ability to learn, that would affect someone's ability to focus while in school, to be able to take some of these tests well. Perhaps they, see more of not really a point in doing well in school because, they don't feel that they're going to be able to get into college because they won't be able to afford it due to economic reasons. So they just don't really worry too much about it. There's so many things to consider as to why there would be such a gap in some of these scores, and it has nothing to do with your race or ethnicity. I can't, I can't really imagine that having to do much with anything. I mean, you place people in different kind of environments. Think of. Before I say this, I don't even know if some of these tests that were presented in this book and that were done by other people before, was it all, Americans or Europeans? Did they test people in, let's say, Asia, in some of these different Asian countries, and Africa and some of those countries too? I don't know exactly how they tested them.
I believe it was just America, but you do bring up a good point.
So if I could actually say something to that, and this is to make just a very basic, kind of walk you through a very basic breakdown of how this can work, how this can actually be seen in other countries, how, and it's more of a matter of sort of the decisions that are made. Like, I think, like, from what I've seen, like, my view has come to see, like, depending upon, like, the development of the civilizations that certain races are in, so, like, white people in America and the West, Asians in Asia, so on, depending upon how their civilizations develop, can obviously change, the average IQ.
As according to the ASVAB. That's a really important part, I think, is when we're talking about this stuff, we're talking about one controlled test method.
Well, I'm just saying in general, like, when applying general IQ tests, not the ASVAB. I'm saying IQ tests.
Well, that's what all this is based on, right? So you get this bell curve. So this is based on the ASVAB.
Well, the bell curve. Yeah, we're talking about one book, though. I'm talking about the discussion, the race and IQ topic in general, which is way beyond the book itself. The book probably got it first started to be talked about in the public sphere, but beyond that, there's a whole bunch of other studies that this book doesn't take into account.
But we also, when you talk about those studies, it's important to also understand what kind of measuring stick that those tests were done against.
Just to talk about other countries, and this is where this is going to be a little bit tricky, but this I've actually read up on. So, in predominantly Muslim countries, so for example, Pakistan, Pakistan's like 90+% Muslim. Studies have shown that there is I think it's like 50 or 60% of the population is committing incest. So what's going on is you're having these basically predominantly Muslim countries with upwards of anywhere between like 20 to 30% to upwards of 70 or 80% of their Muslim population being born out of incest or committing incest on a level that it is having a huge effect on the people.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing the effects of incest, just being born out of incest, there's a high probability of limited cognitive abilities, we'll just say.
Complications,
Complications, we'll say. Anything from higher aggression to just a limited ability for higher reasoning.
Okay, so really quick though, wouldn't that be an environmental factor?
I was about to say that is an environmental and social factor.
Yeah,
because
those are normative ethical standards for that culture.
The Muslim religion, Islam, it's kind of okay with some of that kind of stuff.
Here's what I'm getting at, though. Those are environmental factors to affect how the children are born. So are those children being born with a clean slate, with no cognitive issues, and the environment makes them that way? Or is, as a result of the choices being made in that society, that genetically you're going to have people?
It's genetic outcome due to environmental decisions.
So what I'm saying is certain races across the world, due to different decisions that have been made in their societies, can lead to different outcomes.
Yeah, but that has nothing to do with race, right? Like if any group of any race decided to start engaging in incest, that's been scientifically proven that it's going to come with medical complications.
If we go by that, then that would mean that American inbred hillbillies have a higher IQ than
Muslim inbred.
No, I didn't say they have a higher IQ. I mean,
no, I'm just saying like that.
That is a funny.
I can almost see like someone trying to come up with something like that.
No. It's just
they're trying to.
It's just going to show that obviously
best
genetics.
Kind of view.
It's just going to show that your genetics and your IQ are definitely connected.
Well, I mean, that's a kind of roundabout way to do it, though, right? Because it all stems from environmental behavior, right? It's not as if
not over multiple generations.
It's kind of whenever I see that, I do think your genetics do tend to have some sort of effect on it because, let's say, there are certain hereditary, factors such as mental illnesses, or perhaps you have a gene for Down syndrome or some other degenerative, not degenerative.
Well,
that's not the wrong word. That's the wrong word. But you know what I mean. So genetics can come into play, but I still don't think that is necessarily. It's not a racial thing.
Well, one thing is for sure is it's never mentioned.
It can affect a culture.
So here's
happens to be a certain color, but that doesn't mean that
culture and race, whether we like it or not, are more closely connected than. I mean, culture is definitely separate from race, but they're so closely connected that most of the time when people are of the same race in the same area, they're going to share the same culture to some degree.
Well, it's a law of averages, right? You get a bunch of people in a neighborhood.
Well, in America, it might not be the case because we're the melting pot. But when you go to places like, when you hear Bernie Sanders spouting off about how Norwegian socialism is so great, and you tell him, well, they have a supermajority of white people with a very homogenous culture of sort of, working, kind of working with your fellow man, and there's just the culture is very homogenous. And hey, guess what? They're all white too. Now, I'm not trying to say just race and culture are just completely linked together, but I believe they're to be very closely linked.
Isn't like a lot of British history littered with incest too? Like European history
in the royal family,
right? But I mean,
not among people though.
Are you sure?
Not among the commoner. Yeah, because they didn't have a bloodline to keep pure. It was the royals that had to do that. If anything, the word "fuck" came from fornication under consent of the king. King got to sleep with all the women. So there's your genetic diversity there.
Yeah.
Within the bloodline, he wouldn't marry out, but then outside the bloodline, he could sleep with whoever he wanted to.
Right. I mean, I get what you're saying. I just don't see how it necessarily correlates here because, for one, like a lot of the studies that we're talking about are pulled from the United States. And that's kind of right, because the conversation that we're talking about is kind of like, okay, it's just kind of like a plain race and IQ type deal, right? And it's talking about, like you said, like the differences between like blacks, whites, and Hispanics, the differences in IQ, all kind of in this controlled environment. When you start getting into this kind of stuff, the other kind of stuff that you're talking about, that's certainly a little more squirrely. And I don't think anyone's going to disagree if you've got a bunch of people that are engaging in incest. I think we have enough scientific study at this point that says that that's going to lead to some things that are probably suboptimal after a bit. But I mean, I get the larger point kind of what you're trying to get to. I'm just not sure that that's genetic in the way that a lot of people that argue the race and IQ thing mean when they talk about the genetic ties to IQ. Does that make sense?
Well, it depends on how you view, like, how impressionable are genetics when it comes to IQ. I mean, if a rocket scientist and a neurosurgeon had a kid, what is the likelihood of that kid having, higher IQ than a garbage
think
man and
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I am the child of two high school dropouts, and I have scored up to 125. I mean, I just say it like it's not really, like
right,
thing,
but
and really
that's anecdotal.
But
it's your case.
See, the neurosurgeon and the rocket scientist having a kid, well, those are two very, very high-paying fields. They would have the ability to put their child in the very best of schools, and would likely be very promoting of their child learning as much as possible.
So when I stated how the College Board found that families that made over $200,000 a year, where there was still a higher means SAT score among white families and black families, because we just eliminated the economic factor in that study.
Yeah, but you still have somewhat of a history of a generation before that family. You do have, they probably came from a very, very poor family. That black family making $200,000 a year, they're probably the very first one in their family to make that much money.
So what about the child that was raised in that environment?
What about their child that was raised in that environment?
Yeah, that child that wasn't actually born in poverty. He was born into $200,000 a year family.
Then he probably has a good chance to go to the very best of schools and receive the best education. And as long as parents promote that child to learn and help them along, these social and environmental and economical factors, then that child, despite whatever color they may be, would probably have the exact same outcome as one that's white, as one that's Asian.
It's the emphasis that the family puts on the trajectory of the child's future. I would assume they'd probably have one of the largest, and it's going to differ from kid to kid. I'm sure there's kids that grew up that weren't in those kind of families that made their way to college, and there's kids that did.
Right, because everyone knows.
But you have a higher
probability. Everyone knows a rich family that has that one kid that's just a complete slob.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is with that is there's just a higher probability that the family with a large emphasis on education is going to kick out kids that end up in college.
Right.
Just a law of averages there, right? If you're growing up in a family that has a strong emphasis on education and achievement, there's probably a larger probability that those children will end up educated and achieving.
Right. Like I said, my high school dropout parents, because of what they endured after doing that, they put a big emphasis on education and achievement on me.
So what
which
I'm
is
saying
why
still, though,
I am kind of intelligent. I don't want to toot my own horn here, but I'm just saying.
But I'm just getting at is the fact that when both, and like I say again, with this study showing that when both the white and the black families are making over $200,000 a year, the whites are still scoring a higher mean score on the SAT. Now, why that is, I'm not trying to make any implication as to why that is. I'm just saying it is. This is why people are making the claims. This is why I am talking about it the way I am. I'm not taking any side as say.
Now, this is what I find interesting, though, is that with that difference in SAT scores, they're still making the same amount of money.
Well,
so I find that kind of interesting.
No, I'm saying. No, here's the thing.
So achievement is not determined by IQ or SAT scores.
We're not taking this into account. This is the child of the family that makes $200,000 a year. So this child, both of these children have the equal economic opportunity growing up, and there's still a difference in the scores. So all that
says though is that one kid is better at taking a test than the other kid.
Yeah,
right.
I'm sure there was probably plenty of white kids that scored lower too. Well,
so I have a story. I mean, of course, this is anecdotal as well, but like, tests aren't the end all be all. Some people just aren't great with. Some people just aren't great with tests. When I was going to college, I tested. I've always had a hard time with tests. I don't like tests for some reason. I lose focus really quickly in tests. So I had to take these aptitude tests, right? So they figure out like what kind of courses you're going to be put in. And I did really terrible on one of my English tests for whatever reason. I got put in like English as a second language as my starting class. And I was like, look, it was bad, and I went to the administration and I was like, look, I don't belong in English as a second language. Is there any way possible that I can show my aptitude in the subject of English without it having to be this kind of like standardized test method? Because I just tune out. I'm just not so interested. The minute I have to start looking at that thing for like over an hour and a half, for some reason I can't. It doesn't work great for me. Yeah, they said you can go ahead and do an essay, right? And so they gave me these topics to choose from, and I did an essay, and I got put into honors English after I submitted my essay. And so I think that's a great example of how the measuring stick that you're using can lead to a completely different outcome based on, kind of what you're really trying to find, right? Like if you're just taking this arbitrary test and you're putting it in front of people and then you're saying, oh, this group of people did better with this test and this group of people did better with this test, must be genetic. Then how do you explain these instances where you put a different kind of measuring stick in front of people? And it turns out that this kid who may have tested for English as a second language on this aptitude test on paper, the standardized test, you actually put something in front of, okay, let's see how well you can actually write an academic essay. And then you figure out, wow, this is like honors English level understanding, and we're going to put you in that class. Right? How does standardized testing explain,
That's talking. Now you're talking about specific subjects, though.
Well, that's what the SATs are, right? It's just a test of a bunch of specific subjects. That's what I was saying earlier when I was talking about the ASVAB. Is it's not so much a test that measures ability.
Okay,
it's a test that measures achievement.
Here's that other study. The Minnesota transracial adoption study. Basically, where there were 265 children had their IQs tested at age 7, and at age 17, 196 of those children returned to have their IQs tested again. I don't know why not all of them came back. That's just what the study showed.
Yeah, sure. You're not going to
tested at age 7. The black and biracial, or black and white mixed kids in the sample had significantly higher IQs than their groups do on average in America. However, by age 17, their IQ scores had fallen to meet those averages almost exactly.
So the kids had higher IQs when they were younger, and then when they were older, they had fallen. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And so it shows.
Well, how is that? How is that an argument for genetics in any way, shape, or form, and not an argument for environment?
All that shows is that somewhere in that 10 years, they got distracted and didn't pay enough attention.
No. So listen, what it shows is that if it were genetic, then there wouldn't necessarily be a drop, right? If it's genetic and IQ is immutable, then that number should be the same. But and not only that, but it introduces quite a problem with the initial analysis, because the initial analysis doesn't solve for median age. Right, so you have these analyses that are out, and not many of them at all solve for median age. And I have seen, just as Amos has just referenced, that age can have a difference. You see different people taking IQ tests at different ages, and they're going to get different scores. And none of that was mentioned in this bell curve book or any of the, because and the reason I keep bringing up the bell curve, right, is you talk about like people like Molyneux. That's what they're leaning on. They'll tell you all the time to go and read the science, right. And this is the kind of science that they're telling you to read. And then when you start picking apart the science, you're seeing a lot of imperfect data. And when you talk about an analysis, when you talk about this kind of stuff, that you notice that these kind of things are left out, and that's why people lead to saying that this stuff is racist, because it's like I was talking about with falsification proofs. Like, where's your falsification proof? All you're seeing in a lot of these situations are just people saying, like, we tested this, we tested this, we tested this. Black people tested lower, white people tested higher. They're not explaining median age. They're not explaining a whole bunch of things. They're just presenting data that verifies their hypothesis without any falsification proof or any kind of explanation of these kind of things like median age or other factors like that.
And I think the fact that you could take an IQ test, say I could take one right now and I could get a number and I could be like, I'm not satisfied with that number. I'm going to study some of the things that I saw in that test, and I can study and come back and get a different, probably higher score.
See, but IQ is not testing. It's not something you study for, though.
But the ASVAB is. That's what, like, this.
ASVAB is.
That's my point. IQ, is this whole thing?
IQ is.
Yeah, I can study. You can study for an IQ test.
No. Hold on. The two things that we've talked about so far. One, in the bell curve, we've talked about is the ASVAB. You can absolutely study for the ASVAB and get a higher test.
You can.
The second was the SATs. You can absolutely study for the SATs and get a higher score. Every single instance where you're talking about one of these studies, it's measured by a test. And I will be hard-pressed to find any of those instances where you tell me that there's a test that you cannot study for and get better at to have a better outcome.
IQ test.
What is an IQ test? What IQ test are you using? Are you using the ASVAB? Are you, like, which IQ test?
A standard IQ test that psychologists use, involving pattern recognition, what is it? Sort of logic problems, stuff like that. I'm looking through that right now, but
so here, while you're looking through that, I want to bring up another thing too. So it's not just these studies, and it's not just kind of the stuff. But are you familiar with the funding that was behind the bell curve? Where exactly, and not just the bell curve, right? So when we're talking about what funded the bell curve, this is also in a foundation that has gone on to fund tons and tons of other similarly related studies in race and IQ, and it's probably the most prolific foundation when it comes to funding studies of race and IQ. Are you familiar with that foundation at all?
I am not familiar. No.
So it's called the Pioneer Fund. The Pioneer Fund is a nonprofit that was established in 1937. And its whole goal, the Pioneer Fund, was just to basically figure out, these differences between hereditary and human differences, just kind of as it was, right? And it was started when it started, the Pioneer Fund had directors, right? They had 5 directors. An individual, the last name Draper, right? And this was like the guy pretty much that started it, the big dude on the board. And he was in that position from 37 to 72. He founded the fund. And he founded it because he was interested in hunting down answers for the eugenics movement, which was something that he became incredibly interested in after he visited Nazi Germany in 1935. He met a Third Reich eugenics researcher who inspired him to conduct analysis for the same ends in America. Another individual is Harry Laughlin, who was a director of the Eugenics Record Office in Long Island, New York. Another, Frederick Osborne, was a individual who wrote in 1937 that the Nazi law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring was the most exciting experiment that had ever been tried. Malcolm Donald was a lawyer of Draper, the main individual that started it, right? And so this is another big problem. And so I'm going to break down a little bit of the big issues that I have here. And so we'll talk about something. So you have Stephen Molyneux, right? You talked about Stephen Molyneux. I'll mention him for a bit. He's real big into this. He's real big into the race IQ thing. And while, I'm not like everyone else who's going to like dogpile on the guy. I do think that Stefan Molyneux, I call him Stefan is probably how he would prefer his name to be pronounced. He seems like a real smart guy. There's some stuff he says that are I think pretty good things. I've never seen eye to eye with him and his thoughts on this. And usually he tries his best to make educated arguments. But there's a video that came out not long ago where he goes and he says, I went to Poland recently, and Poland is 99% white. And when I went there, I didn't get yelled at. I didn't get screamed at. I didn't get threatened. There's no identity politics. There's no this and there's no that. And he says in this video, in the past, I have argued against alt-right and white nationalism, in his words, but I am an empiricist. And he goes on and on and on to talk about this kind of thing. But it's like, you say that kind of stuff, and it's hard for me when I'm looking at analyses and data that it by and large lacks falsification proof. It is hard for me to look at that, and it's hard for me to look at the Pioneer Fund, who is the main funding entity when it comes to a majority of the race and IQ studies that have gone on and been published, and not think that there's a bias involved. Right? There's tons and tons of data, like we're talking about median age, that's left out. Right? A lot of this stuff is a failure of omission. If you're not familiar with it, you go Google it. It's an error because it's not as if to say that the data is a lie. It's not to say that there was an ethical problem in the presentation of the data in the sense of like, it's not like someone modified it to be something it isn't. Like, I don't think that happens, but I do think that by omitting certain data, it tells the story that they want it to tell, right? They have the hypothesis, they gather the data, and from day one, from goal one, from step one, the goal was to prove the hypothesis, right? There's far less effort to disprove or falsify the hypothesis. And then when you look at the bias, as in where this funding is coming from, fans of the Nazi regime, people that were inspired by Nazis, people that were proponents of eugenics in America, that's when I really start to give it some serious side eye. And it's very, very hard for me to take it serious from an academic standpoint when you start to kind of uncover some of this stuff.
It seems to remind me of Andrew Wakefield's study quote, proving that the MMR vaccine led to higher increased cases of autism.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. That's what data can do.
It sounds fraudulent.
The thing is,
it's not that
it's a failure of omission. It's an error in omission.
Right.
It's not that his studies are a lie. It's not like he fabricated data. It's not like he manipulated data. It's not like he made up data. He had real data. He presented the data. He presented the data next to a hypothesis, but you can tell that the data was presented with a bias to confirm the hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so it's an error of omission. Right. And so when you talk about the bell curve specifically, there have been people, right? So in the bell curve, they tried to control for socioeconomic status, right? So it wasn't just like hard data. They did do a little bit of manipulating of things to try and keep it even. But you've got people that have taken that same data, right, and they've applied like different measures to it, and you get completely different results. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that there's no falsification proof here. There's no falsification model. There's no attempts to make sure that this is a rock solid case to be made, right? In an analysis, you want it to be that when you introduce more data, your hypothesis is further solidified, right? So you can look at the NFA, Australia's NFA. Here's a good example of how data can be, really, really tricky. We have an article on think-liberty.com where I break down, I kind of analyze the NFA. And what's interesting about it is most of the stuff that you see on like Now This and you see on Vox, they're going to start at 1996, which is the introduction of Australia's NFA, which is the national, the whole firearms thing that they did. And they say, okay, when the implementation of the NFA came, firearm and violence related, to firearms was on sharp decline. And it was. And if you look at the data, that's absolutely the case. And they spout off this stuff that says, suicides by firearm reduced by X amount and homicides by firearm reduced by X amount. And that's true.
Yet
and then,
suicides and homicides did not go down.
Exactly right. So it's an error in omission, right? Because they just leave out the fact that regardless of the fact that suicides or, in 2016, I think, suicides were at the highest they've been in 10 years.
Right.
In Australia. It's an error in omission. They left it out to make it seem like the case that they were trying to make was super, super strong. And then furthermore, when you introduce more data, it further falsifies the analysis, because if you pull back the window, so if you just look at 1996 and onward, then yes, when the NFA was instituted, there has been, as a result, a sharp decline. Now, I'm not going to say as a result, but there has been a sharp decline in violence as it relates to firearms. But if you pull back and you look deeper, if you start at 1970, that decline was already in action before the NFA was instituted. Right, so that's a huge difference that you're going to find within that analysis if you put it through the rigors of falsification, which were not done with the bell curve. And furthermore, did you guys not know that the bell curve was not peer reviewed? It was never submitted for peer review. It wasn't ever submitted for peer review.
That's very interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that to me it makes absolutely no sense. You take people of whatever race, place them in different kind of environments. You look at an inner city. You have people of different races there, all coming out to about the same result in success and general, I guess you can say, intelligence, achievement, whatever you want to call it, whether they're white, black, Latino, it doesn't matter. You have people out in the country, farmers, they're all around the same level. People in bigger cities with lots of, great schools, no matter what race they are, they have around the same level of success, intelligence, achievement, all of these kind of things. You take a person from out in the country, out on the farms, place them in a bigger city, out of their environment. They're going to be able to go to a construction company, probably land the job because they already know how to do everything. They can thrive there. You place someone from a city out in the country, they're going to have a lot of trouble. They're going to have to relearn a bunch of things. You have a... So if you put a person of any race in out in the savannah in Africa, if they're white, Asian, whatever, they're going to grow up to be the same level of intelligence, everything, as everyone around them. If you look at different kind of things, typically on a lot of these things, you see Asians scoring very, very high. So that would mean that farmers in mainland China are just as intelligent as people in Hong Kong working for a tech company? No. That is not the case. It all depends on...
Well, it's also
environment.
It depends on environment, but I can't stress this enough. It's the measuring stick as well. And I keep saying this. I keep saying this because I think it's important to recognize that this idea that all of what encompasses human intelligence can be boiled down to one finite number. Like, I challenge it. I don't believe it. I don't think it's the case. There was a study done by Western University that proved there's several different types of intelligence that people can track, and some people score differently in all of it. You've heard of emotional intelligence and things like that. It's exactly what you were just talking about, Lonnie. Right? Like, if you put a Harvard graduate in sub-Saharan Africa, gave him a weapon and said, go ahead and make sure your family can eat for a year, he might not have the best time doing that. Right. So different people are going to be able to excel at different things. If you want to conduct a study, right. And there was also a global bell curve study, right? The global bell curve race IQ inequality worldwide. Shocker. It came to the same conclusion that the bell curve book did. But guess who funded that? All right. That was also funded by the Pioneer Fund. And it was also done on a test that was clearly a test that favors one group of people, right? You're not going to each place in each culture, figuring out what they value, what it takes to survive in that culture, and what would equate to a high quotient of intelligence based on those environments, right? You're just still doing that one standardized test. So the measuring stick is very important here.
I can't possibly imagine going into some place in Africa where, even if there is a school,
you guys want to take an ASVAB?
The people probably went there to maybe third grade, enough to learn how to read and write, and then they were back on the farm, and then they were like, here's a test. And
well, and like I said, so specifically with the ASVAB or the SAT and anything, those are a test to measure achievement, not ability. Right? So
I'm going to here, person in Africa, I'm going to test your knowledge of English.
Test your knowledge on something that there's a good chance that it's not something that you're like super knowledgeable in, and that's somehow going to be used to come to some rock solid conclusion, right? That's the frustrating part, is there's nowhere in these books is there a mention of data that contradict the hypothesis. Nowhere in these books is there a mention of a theory that contradicts the core assumption. Nowhere in here is there anything other than corroborating stuff that just goes to solidify and support the hypothesis. There's no falsification anywhere. To me, that's a big red flag. I'm big into analytics. I'm big into statistics. I'm big into making sure, right? Because I mean, look, as a part of libertarian stuff, like, I want to be able to put forth good arguments, but I have to be rigorous in my analysis of these arguments, because I don't want it to be so easy for someone to just come up and say, hey, look, you fucked this up. You got this wrong. So I'm going to make sure that I'm checking under every rock, and I'm looking around every corner to make sure I have everything right. So I want to introduce a theory that challenges my own, and I want to be right about it. It makes me feel stronger and more confident about my theory. I could leave out, I can omit anything all day and make statistical cases until the day is long about things. That's easy to do, right? To introduce data and still be correct is hard.
It's all very unscientific. It would be like a creationist trying to use evolutionary science to somehow prove the existence of God, and then mixing things up, and there you go, that's why God exists. Well, what started the Big Bang? God.
Gotcha.
It doesn't make any. It's very unscientific. especially President of Bell Curve. Maybe some of these studies that Amos mentioned, maybe funded by someone else that, maybe they're looking at a different goal, a different reason why these things are happening. And, but definitely I can tell that with the Bell Curve, which is usually the book that most people cite, whenever they're talking about this kind of stuff, it's very unscientific.
That's either the Bell Curve or Amos was talking about SATs. There's always some standardized test that this is up against, and it's like I said,
I'm pretty resourceful. I don't think I would last a week in Africa. I'd probably die of malaria. But I would have to make a shelter. I would have to fashion a weapon of some sort. And I don't know what berries I can eat and which ones I can't. I can't catch a gazelle. I don't know how to do any of that kind of stuff. Yet the people there do. So in that sense, they are much smarter than I am, even if I may score higher on an IQ test than them.
Sure. I'm sure. Okay. Amos, we haven't heard from Uniman. Is there anything,
no, oh geez. So, no, I just had a couple thoughts on, and I just wanted to say this, again, I'm not necessarily on any side on this. I've read these studies and talked to people about it, and slightly beyond skeptical, but nowhere near holding any solid view to say, race and IQ and genetics and all this are a solid thing that's it's for sure a thing. And I just find it to be there's definitely more to look into, and you bring up a good point that a lot of these studies have to be really broken down, and they should just actually and non-biased, or at least if there is a bias, that it should be addressed. They should definitely really look at what is every single thing they accounted for, both what is actually put in the study, but also what's been omitted and such.
That's why peer review is so important in these kind of cases.
Right. Yeah, no, all that definitely. But just from what I've read and what I've taught, discussions I've had with people, there's definitely different aspects to IQ. There's our intelligence is there's quite a bit of our intelligence that's still unexplored in studies. Just academia there's always talk about, what is proper IQ test. And yes, a lot of these studies were of course done in the US versus the rest of the world. And I get all that. But there's just a couple things I'm thinking about, for example, with the cases if these tests, these obviously SAT tests and the ASVAB definitely are it's a specific measuring stick that's measuring a certain kind of thing that doesn't quite take into account everything about IQ. Just doesn't mean just because you have a high ASVAB doesn't mean you're smart. Just because you have a high AC doesn't mean you're smart. There's a good chance, the Dow Jones reflects upon the economy, but does it really reflect on everything in the economy? Obviously not.
Well, it makes sense, right? So when you look at it from a perspective of some of the things that, well, I'll go to the bell curve again, that it tries to presuppose, to what it's saying. Look, of course, right? The ASVAB is essentially built to see how good you are at these core concepts that are valued in American society. Right. From an educational standpoint. So abso-fucking-lutely. We have an entire system, an economy, an entire education system, an entire industry built on those values. So yes, if you know those things more, then there's no reason whatsoever why you wouldn't then go on to be more successful, because you have shown that you have a high aptitude for the things that make this specific country's economy work.
So
yeah,
what I'm getting
like,
at is, like some of these studies have shown, when you account for, like, I'm going back to, of course, this College Board numbers to show that, both white and black families with the same amount of money in the family still had different average scores. Now, does that mean, and I'm not going to say you were saying one way or another, but does that mean the SAT tends to favor white people versus black people? Does it mean
that's never
be a test?
That's not a claim I ever made about the ASVAB, or
I never. Yeah, no. I'm not saying you're making. I'm just saying, does that mean that, or is the SAT score just not a good measure of intelligence across different races? Because
it's just one of those things. I think the SAT is a good measure of aptitude and test taking for certain topics, right? But like, as we talked about, I'm one example, and I'm sure there's plenty of other examples in this country where someone might do not as well on one version of a test. But like, the important thing about that example, the reason I shared it, is because if the test is to say, we want to measure your aptitude in English, and I take the test and I do terrible on it, right? And that's it. And if we just decided that that's that, then it's been decided that I have a horrible level of intelligence in English. But I challenged it. And another measuring stick, a different measuring stick, was introduced, and it turns out it was discovered that I had a far higher aptitude in English than was originally reported on the test. We just used a different measuring stick and came to find out, oh wow, actually,
So looking at the aggregate of both of different people groups in the U.S., let's say, just again, white people, black people, Latinos. And let's say there's an equal sort of breakdown of different people with different kinds of aptitudes that you can't quite measure in the tests that we have available to us.
Right.
Maybe it's going to take us a while. But you have the same breakdown because let's just assume, I'm just going to assume you have the same breakdown of people that you can't measure versus the people that you can measure in other ways. You're still seeing a discrepancy.
I think I can explain that discrepancy.
Like, how is there still such a gap?
I think I have an idea. Okay, so children of people making a high amount of money, there's a difference in white, black, and Latino. Me, myself, being, I guess I would be Latino, half Mexican, I still experience some of this, and I believe that this also likely happens to black people as well, because I know what I experienced, being Latino or Hispanic or whatever you want to call. So there's a cultural thing where a lot of times people in these certain groups, they feel that they are meant to act a certain way because they are a certain color. So if you're not doing that, then you're being white. You're acting white. You're talking white. You're doing all those things, and you're not being who, quote unquote, you really are. And that is very, very confusing for a child growing up, because I experienced it myself. Because listening to me, you probably would never know that, what I look like or what color I am, because I sound white. I guess if white had a sound, I sound pretty white. So therefore, growing up, you get these kind of things where these kids feel like, okay, well, maybe I got to hang out with these people, because I don't really fit in with the white people because I'm not white and they treat me weird, like I'm their pet or something. But then I'm kind of outcast by the black people, but I kind of want to, there's a lot of confusion growing up, and that does affect your ability to learn. And okay, well, maybe I shouldn't study so much because then I'm going to be nerdy and that's white, quote unquote, white or whatever. While the white children don't really have that issue. And
are you talking about
I
privilege?
kind of think
I said, you talking about privilege?
I don't want to call it privilege.
Dun it.
I hate that word, but I do kind of think that if we were gonna bring this in, I think this would probably be an appropriate place to kind of place it. You know, you have
so. What's the statistical evidence of privilege?
You are fake news.
I don't think there is any, anyways.
I mean, again, we're looking at
basically what I'm saying is the rich black kid will probably be, and the rich Latino kid will probably feel very disconnected to their culture and feel pulled back into the, whether it's whatever their racial culture, I guess, if such a thing were to exist. So therefore, they would probably be underperforming in school.
How do the Asian and the Indian families do so much better than white people then? With less money?
Oh, shit!
That I do not know. I have no idea.
Because now we're talking about more than just the whites and the blacks and the Latinos. Now we're talking about
that probably has to go back to family. I mean, I think a lot of this falls on.
I think that's a family thing. Yeah.
I think a lot of this falls on family values. I think that's a big deal, right? Environment plays a large part there.
Are we saying basically? I mean, so we're agreeing that there's actual cultural differences between these, basically the major races, so to speak, in the U.S.
Yes.
I think that's completely agreeable. I think that tons of people have different cultural preferences and norms that they...
Because that could go into a whole nother thing.
Yeah, because there's an American culture,
sure,
and then there's subcultures within that based on the music you listen to, based on so many different kind of things. And then there are some subcultures, based on race, based on... maybe not necessarily race, but like your ethnicity, what country your grandparents may have come from. Just there's so many things like that. And sometimes I do feel that some of these cultures, they may want to preserve them a bit too much, and they try to pull people that are breaking away from it back into it. So therefore, that's why I kind of think whenever if you have a discrepancy in SAT scores, things like that, I kind of feel that may be coming from a culture trying to pull back at someone that's breaking away from it. Because I know it happens, in Hispanic cultures, a lot. So I imagine it likely happens to black kids as well that are doing well and stuff like that. They're doing well. They don't speak with a lot of slang, so they're acting white, and they're not being black, and they're not true to themselves, true to whatever. And that does affect you. That does affect you growing up, because I know. And me, especially being mixed race, I didn't know what the hell was going on. So there's a lot of that going on, and the kid may not try as hard because he doesn't want to be nerdy, or he doesn't want to feel like he's being white and betraying Hispanic or black or whatever the case may be.
Really, though, that boils down to...
Does that make any sense at all?
It does, and it boils down to the environmental... It boils down to the environmental side of it. And yeah, I mean, we're just about at it here. We've been at about an hour, so we can get toward wrapping it up. This was a good talk. I think we've all basically, at least if for nothing else, we've all clearly stated our positions on this stuff. For me, looking at analysis and looking at rigorous challenging of hypotheses, this doesn't meet the smell test for me. It doesn't at all, because the instant that you start introducing other data, the case becomes far less solid as it ever seems on its face when this is presented. You always see it presented as it's some rock solid case, and then it doesn't take long at all to realize that in a majority of these cases that I've come across, it's an error and omission. And that's, to me, shows a bias in that, like I've been kind of, beating the drum here, but it just shows that they're trying to confirm, not falsify the hypothesis, which to me shows a bias. And whenever there's an analysis with a clear bias, it's garbage, because it's basically being done to intentionally tell a story that was set out to be told. Anyone can do that with data. I work with data all day, all the time. And if I wanted to sit there and say, hey, I'm going to take this data set and I'm going to make it tell a story that makes me look super good, I'm going to show it to my boss, it's easy to do. I could do that really easily. Super, super easily. But there's someone else at my job that might look at that data, pull it back a little more, and find out that I am committing a failure in omitting data that falsifies that story, and finds out that it's a different story altogether. And that's a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think if me, a homeschooled individual that did not attend college, can look at this and go, yeah, that's a bunch of crap, and break it apart, then it wasn't very rock solid to begin with. I mean, I consider myself somewhat intelligent, but I guess I'm not as educated as some, clearly not as much as you, Vinny. However, yeah, if I can look at it and be like, and kind of break it apart and be like, okay, well, they didn't consider this. They didn't consider this. Well, what about this? What about this? Well, what about this? Well, okay. Well, what, how does this come into play? Then if I can do that, well, yeah, it wasn't, it was on some pretty shaky ground to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Amos, is there anything that you want to get out before we get out of here?
I mean, obviously, since I'm half Asian and half white, I am the smartest person in this room.
Right.
Okay, so look, since I'm half white, half mixed, that means I'll be the dumbest person here. Okay.
Exactly. You already get it.
All right, cool. Yeah, I see how this works now. All right.
Yeah.
This is a great study. This is great.
That guy's the Deion Sanders of retards.
Thanks, Charles.
Guys, seriously though, I am not actually saying that. Just so everyone understands, I'm not actually saying that.
You are fake news.
I don't want messages tomorrow saying that you got a racist at Think Liberty now.
Oh, we've had plenty of messages this whole time saying that there were racists here, and we're like, who, where?
Well, that's the problem.
See, you can't play the race card. I'm half Asian.
That's also a big problem, though, right? Like that's another big problem with a lot of this stuff. Is that, like, I went into my opinions here, and it's frustrating because I think I have legit concerns, and hopefully I articulated my arguments well enough to know that I'm not just coming from a place to where I'm like screeching about something because I just feel like, that's racist because everyone else says it's right. Like I feel like I have educated opinions that lead to the positions that I have, but I do feel that people these days are a little too quick to like be really excited to find hidden racists all over the place. And they're just like, everything's become about like microaggressions and hidden hatreds, and everyone's a hidden Nazi and this and that. And I think that it's excessive. It's totally excessive. I mean, and what I've found in most instances is people that were actually racist, you don't have to do a lot of investigating to figure that out.
It's almost like everyone is trying to perform like a racist seance. Like,
right,
there's a racist in this room.
Everyone wants to be the guy that's like, aha, I found him. You know, like I found the. Everyone wants to have that. Like it feels like, not everyone, but it feels like a lot of these people are just in this to have that Scooby-Doo moment, right? When they go and they like, oh, Lonnie, look, and you take off the Lonnie mask and it's Hitler. And it's
well, hey, why do I gotta be Hitler?
No, it was just an example, but you know what I mean.
Obviously,
though?
I am.
Hitler would find me an abomination.
Yeah, we'll say we'll call it Amos since he was the one that's.
No, actually, Vinny. No, Vinny's Hitler.
Right. I'm the least suspecting. But you know what I mean, though,
because you're white.
There you go. There you go. God damn it. But you know what I mean, though, right? Like it. And I think you guys probably agree, like people are too quick to do it to where it makes it hard to have these conversations without like people just automatically get thrown into their teams, right? Like we were talking about, like this has been getting thrown around. I have the opinions I have, and I voiced a bit of my concerns about it. And like this guy called me Antifa. He was like, he's like, you fucking Antifa Democrat leftist bullshit. I'm like, what? No, like this.
I just kind of hope that my possible explanation to the discrepancies in SAT scores wasn't my quick twitch muscle moment, or the Bill Burr.
You'll have to listen to it again.
Bill Burr skit where he was talking about the sports newscaster that was like, oh well, you see, well African Americans, they have quick twitch muscle and whatever. He ended up getting fired like the next day or whatever.
Right.
I just hope that wasn't my quick twitch moment. Well, you see, black people, well, you see, they don't like success, and I just hope it didn't come out sounding like that at all. So
we need some Bill Burr sound clips there, Vinny.
I know. Maybe I can. I'll track some down. So maybe the next time. But to kind of wrap this up, if there's any way to say it, I think the larger thing is there's so much nuance that goes into this kind of stuff, and there's so much to unpack when you're trying to understand these things and why different people operate in different ways. I think that it's really important to understand that boiling something that is as big a construct as intelligence into a finite number is really difficult, and it creates a lot of complications because different people excel at different things, and that might be valuable in different cultures or different areas and different locations, and that's completely it changes things. And not only that, you put in more data and more information from different places, and it changes things too. So it's just to say that I don't think that any of this stuff is simple enough to take a bunch of aggregate data and walk away and have conclusions with it. And I think that that's one thing I'm assuming that we can all actually probably kind of agree on here, is that it seems as this is much more complicated, much bigger, much more nuanced than it's given credit for from any kind of just large aggregate just kind of an analysis that attempts to make it simple.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see a study that factors in everything, like median age and so many different things like economic backgrounds and whatnot.
Well, and access
that
too.
Is truly right, yeah, and it is truly just the most unbiased scientific study on this possible, because I believe that if you do that, the result will be, hey, we are all the same. So I would like to see that study, because, I think that's going to be the result, is that, okay, we just look different. And that's it.
Well, there's a lot of stuff.
One thing else.
Go ahead.
Oh, one thing I'll say is, and it's, it has, I think it goes beyond just we look different. I mean, there's obvious differences. I mean, just in a physical sense. I mean, there's the whole discussion over gender differences, men and women. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw the Australian handball team was led to victory by their trans woman.
That's crazy. That shouldn't be allowed. Like,
oh yeah, it definitely shouldn't be allowed. But I mean, it's showing a clear issue with how we're defining sex and gender, and not taking into account that there are clear differences between men and women in terms of physical ability. And
Sure.
even if you,
I mean, that's not really
right. But I mean, but you can sort of know that because that's a very clean cut. Just like, hey, men.
Somebody posted something. They were like talking about the differences and men and women, and like as if it was some shocking new discovery. I'm like, man, you're breaking some new ground there, Darwin.
Oh yeah, but I mean, we've noticed these huge differences. We've also seen there's obviously clear differences in physical performances. I mean, it's no secret that we know that most of the NBA is black men. It's no secret that the fastest men in the world in track and field events are black guys.
But that's training. Hold on though. One quick second though that's a little different in this in that that's the kind of thing, right? Is it's easily observable just at first glance, right? Someone that is 6'3", 250 is going to just wreak havoc on.
No, I'm getting to that though, Vinny. So what I'm getting at is there's obviously these are factors that when I'm talking about gender differences, when I'm talking about obviously certain physical prowess found different between different races, or even just physical characteristics that we notice, whether it's skin color, whether it's the ability to stay in the sun longer. There's different things obviously different between different races. Now, we are nowhere near understanding the full scope of the human mind, whether it's intelligence, consciousness, just what's going on, even what's going on in that head of ours. We only have a very basic understanding versus what is really going on. So things like IQ, things like how that ties with race, how that ties with just groups in general, not just race and specific races, how that ties into the environment. These studies have definitely brought forth a discussion, but I think it should continue, and that there might be something. I don't want to be so quick to dismiss that everything else we've seen is there's totally differences, but somehow IQ is the one thing where there's zero difference between people groups. I'm just going to say people groups.
But that's not related though, right? Like you're not talking about the difference between when you're talking about the difference between like a female MMA fighter and a guy that says he's a girl and he's breaking someone's skull. That's a much clearer difference, right? What we're talking about has much more nuance.
We've observed it and we've verified it.
Well, you can observe it and verify it easily, right? It's not nearly as complicated. But when you're talking about intelligence, there's so many different factors. Like for example,
exactly what I'm saying.
Well, so for example, right? But I'm saying is that falsification proves enough for you to tell that an aggregate assumption is bullshit, right? And see, like you have the Scottish.
Obviously, it is.
You have the Scottish that for years and years and years everyone thought were dumb as piles of dog shit, right? And then the second that you have people there that get past Gaelic and they can understand a different language, it turns out that there's not a lot of academic stuff at that time that was written in Gaelic. And the minute that they were able to learn a different language, you have Scottish people achieving things in far greater numbers at a rapid rate. Because the only thing that was in their way was a barrier to language. Once they learned that language, they had the ability to learn other stuff that was written in other languages, and it was off to the races in an extremely rapid rate.
Yeah,
so they weren't any.
I get that.
They weren't any dumber. Too. It was just there was access, limited access.
But to say that we have all these physical differences except for the brain. Somehow the brain is just the same across every human being.
Well, that's not the case at all. Right.
So what I'm getting at is to say IQ among people groups is just going to be the same aggregate all the time. If you factor in, and at this point, it seems like just a ever-growing list of factors to
yeah, but so here's the thing though, is I'm not the one saying that it's the same. The people that say that there are baseline differences per race are the ones that are saying it's the same. Those are the ones that are saying black people all have around the same average IQs. That's what the bell curve is. White people all have around the same average IQs, right? What I'm saying is that it's completely different based on an individual by individual basis, by a family basis, by a culture by culture basis, by so many things that this is not something that can be solved with aggregate data.
It's showing distributions, though. It's not showing averages.
Right, but what you're sitting there saying that it's not wise to say that things can be the same, and what I'm turning around and saying is that that's precisely what the bell curve is trying to say.
I'm saying the same across the entire human race.
There's the same standard. No, but I'm not sitting there. But my argument isn't that there's a base intelligence that everyone has the same access to, and it's the same, and everyone is capable of doing anything. Doesn't matter. What I'm saying is there's too many factors. There's too many external factors, too many environmental factors, too many cultural factors that every time you do this study and you falsify it properly, you're only going to end up with a bunch of fragmented data that doesn't tell a story at all.
Yeah, and really, as far as physical differences, I mean, you have Nordic white people that are over 6 foot on average. I mean, you have. Are they
running under 10-second 100-meter times?
I mean, some might be able to. I don't know. I haven't kept up with the Swedish 100-meter dash team.
But I mean,
but what I'm saying is that there may be certain people that have different physical. I don't know, whatever. But there's still training involved with all of that. I mean, these people just
obviously,
aren't
well, certain people
they don't
are
naturally
probably
know how to regulate their breathing.
So how can
all these kind of things? But
how can an Olympic athlete who's trained his whole life, who's white, versus an Olympic athlete who's trained his whole life is black, and how can they have radically different performances
in radically different sports, though? So that goes back to the point I was making.
I mean, okay, but
hold on. That goes back to the point I was making about IQ being one finite number, making it very challenging to quantify exactly what's going on here. Because a black athlete that trains might be better at certain things, and a white athlete that trains in Olympia might be better at other different things. They might be two completely different things that these people excel at, but they both have Olympic level talent, right? They're both Olympians, right? That's the whole thing in it is IQ attempts to summarize a whole bunch of shit and put one number on it.
Yeah, and the fact that not every African athlete is crossing the finish line at the exact same time. I mean,
well,
there's,
of course not.
You know, I mean, there's Africans that come in last place. I mean, it's a race, and some people are better at it. You know, I mean, I think a lot of this is learned. It's learned behavior.
All right. Well, no, okay. So we're going on. Well, no. I think that, I mean, look, we could clearly, we all have our opinions. We can go on this all day. We're at about getting close to an hour and 40 minutes. So we should probably wrap it up. Please, everybody, remember to check out the Shitlord Preachers podcast. And please remember to go to all of our family of websites, Being Libertarian, think-liberty.com, and Rational Standard. And check everything out. Do all this stuff. I don't know. We've had you for a long time, so I feel like it's probably time to go. Is there anything else you guys want to say before we go, or is it cool if we can wrap it here?
We're good to go.
I just want to say that Amos is wrong about everything, and
you sit on a throne.
And I'm never coming back to this podcast.
This is good. Thank you for joining. You know, look, it's tough to do what Amos did here, to talk about something that's a contentious topic, to be the one versus the other two that have a different opinion, and to be talking about trying to make an argument for something that's like one of the least popular things to make an argument about. So brave. So very brave. We appreciate you joining, Amos. All right. Well, like always, whether or not anyone likes it, we will probably be back again.